So distracting. Okay, so here we are. Oh, somebody's got a Texas flag. Good job. Okay. So here we are, and we're going to talk about Native Americans and colonization and a whole bunch of stuff that's probably slightly inappropriate, but it's not really inappropriate, but it's the stuff we look at and go like, hey, we weren't so nice back then, but we were, the same as everybody else who was doing stuff back then, which is probably not so nice. So we'll get after it here in a sec. Let me show you a weekly question. I think, yeah, yours has the list of all the weekly questions somewhere from each unit. And also each unit, that's how your quiz is grouped. And what I was working on when I was ignoring you guys before was your quiz for unit 1. Sorry, my shoulder's really sore. Your quiz from unit 1, which is over the first 4 chapters. So, all right, somebody's coming in. Check him off. Okay, so our question for today, compare Indian society with that of Europeans. And by Indian, I don't mean folks from India. I mean the Native Americans, indigenous people, the folks who were here when the folks from Europe met them. And they went, hey, why are you here? We want this land. What are you doing? So those folks. And the book is pretty helpful here. It's got different sections that say tribes on, oh, let me look. Book. Mine's blue. But it's really divided nicely for you for this question. And that's also why I tell you should really use the book for the questions, because when I make the questions there, I'm using the book to make them. So the question is, compare Indian society with that of Europeans, differences, similarities, talk about religion, land, gender roles, as well as notions of freedom. And then the book sections at the beginning of chapter 1, settling of the Americas, Indian societies of the Americas, mound builders of the Mississippi Valley, Western Indians, which is going to be like Pueblo kind of folks, Indians of Eastern North America, Native American religion, so there you talk about religion, land and property, so it tells you land and property, gender relations, gender roles, and then European views of Indians and Indian freedom. So it's really set up nicely. It should be me like, that question doesn't make sense. I can't find anything in the book. That just tells me you're not really looking in the book. So just look in the book. That's the whole idea. And, don't just Google. I know how you people are, Googlers. Don't just Google. What else do I want to tell you? Oh, the question someone always asks, which you should never ask in your college class. How long does the answer have to be? Because when you ask that question, your professor hears this. What's the least possible amount of work I can do? That's what your professor hears. So that may be really what you want to ask, but don't ask it, because we've given our life's work to teach this class, and you're telling us this is a waste of my time. So don't do it. And the truth is, someone else will ask. Someone always asks. So just let them ask. I would say in general, people can answer a question in about a page, and the answer is pretty specific. I mean, some of you don't like that. I don't know, kind of depends. But also some of you write differently than others. Some of the questions are going to be more specific than others. This one, the answer will be fairly general, but kind of long, because you got to talk about religion, land, and gender roles. But it's so nicely set up in the book. And you'll notice that even that part of the book is maybe 5 or 6 pages. It's pretty short. So you'll be in good shape on this one. There's a sample question and answer in there. So look at that for kind of general ideas about how specific you need to be. And of course, if you finish early, you can always send it in and ask me, and I'll tell you like, no, that looks pretty good. And, or no, you should add some about this. Okay. And just a gentle reminder about when stuff is due. If you look on the syllabus page, there's that section in the syllabus that has the calendar part. Let me see if I can find it. 1301 syllabus is still here. spring syllabus. All right, let me share it again. And this should be in your Blackboard page in the section that says syllabus, because you know I'm clever like that. So we went over this the first day. You may have just checked out at some point, or you may just not remember, but it's that part right there where it says class schedule. It'll tell you like chapter 1, that's what we go over this week. What you should do is read the syllabus, get the book. And chapter 2 is what we go over the second week. And then weekly questions 1 and 2 are due on Friday. Weekly question 3, due the next Friday. So most of the stuff's due, everything's due on a Friday. Okay. You turn in the questions individually. So there'll be individual slots in the assignments page for these things. Okay. But you can do them early. You could honestly do them late. I wouldn't if I were you. Early is better. And if you do them early enough and you want some feedback, email them to me. Okay. But all the due dates are there. And also on the assignments page, when you go to look for the assignments, it tells you what date stuff is due. Okay. All right. All right. So weekly question, Native Americans. All right. So notes. Okay, here we go. And these notes are on the course documents page in Blackboard. And when somebody asks in about 2 or 3 minutes, can we get a copy of these notes? You can feel free to tell them they're on the course documents page, because you know they're getting a soda right now. They're not drinking water like me. I'm drinking water. Yeah. Sorry, with very large pieces of ice, clearly. All right, let's go. I noticed when I looked at my notes and I looked at the chapter that my notes are really a lot shorter than the chapter, because the chapter talks, I'm pretty good about the Native American part, but I noticed my notes are not as strong about the colonization part. So sorry, I'll just say that up front. But your question's about Native Americans, so it's not, you know, it's understandable. Also, one other thing, you know, I told you there's a quiz with each unit and that you'll get a list of things to review for the quiz. I should have that posted tomorrow for unit 1, which is chapters 1 through 4. And that quiz is second week in February, so it's not super urgent. However, since you are reading chapter 1, you know, it'd probably be nice to have that available. All right, and there's certain people in US history, if their names show up in the book, we feel obligated to mention them. Adam Smith is one of those. For whatever reason in US history, we don't like economists except for Adam Smith and that British guy. What's the British guy? Talks about deficit spending during depressions. I can't even think of his name, it's terrible. Keynes. That's who it is, John Maynard Keynes. Just trust me. He might show up in 1302. But Adam Smith, we like him because he defines, essentially writes a definition of capitalism. Why wouldn't we like him in the United States? And about mercantilism, the idea that you should develop colonies for the economic benefit of your country, not to help the people whose land you took over. Okay, so he's a Scottish economist from, you know, a long time ago. I think he's Scottish, but anyway, Adam Smith's quote, beginning of the chapter, discovery of America was one of the 2 greatest and most important events recorded in the history of mankind. Must be true if Adam Smith says it, because, you know, capitalism. But clearly from a British perspective, English, UK later on perspective, this makes sense because it kind of opens the world to colonization, although I know they had already harassed the Irish before that. And then the book goes into talking about how people got to the Americas. They probably, the original people who got here probably walked over the Bering Strait. Can you imagine? That's a really long walk. Most people who think anything about where people came from and where they started think they started somewhere in Africa and then dispersed from there very slowly because, you know, it's a long walk. And if there weren't reasons to go, you didn't go. So eventually there's an ice age and climate change and all that sort of stuff. those they walk across, or maybe some giant furry elephants with tusks chase them. I don't know. We don't know because there's not a whole lot of written history about this. Also, I always wondered, like, how do we know that any of this stuff is true? Because there is no written history from this time period, but it's usually from our friends, the archaeologists and the anthropologists, who study things that are left behind, or maybe drawings that retell the stories that were handed down over generations. So they estimate populations by the material culture that's left behind, the stuff that archaeologists dig up. This, okay. All right. Okay. First Americans probably crossed the Bering Strait, which is a little string of islands now, but was probably connected. Either that or they guys walked and swam from Asia to Alaska. Yeah. Probably they came over in an ice age when the large animals died, agriculture starts to develop. And when you have agriculture, you tend to have more of what we think of as civilization, where you hang out in one place and stay in a house or a hut or a cliff or wherever you stay, and you eat grain of some sort or squash, whatever you eat, but whatever you grow. Yeah. And you might have where you raise animals, animal husbandry, ranching, that kind of stuff, domesticated animals, but that's going to be quite a bit later. If you live near the water, you're going to fish. That's good. Yeah, fishing is nice. All right, so then they talk about the larger societies in the Americas. Of course, the biggest ones were in the warmer climates. So we're talking Mexico, Central America didn't have a whole lot of big societies, but South America. So the Incas were in Peru and the Aztecs were in Mexico. And eventually the Aztecs will wander down to Peru and take over some of their stuff. Both of these societies were probably pretty large, and they had some pretty large cities. The biggest Aztec city was probably near modern day Mexico City, that city that starts with a T, which could be Tenochtitlan, or I have no idea, but that's the T city, yes. And a city of 250,000 would be enormous in prehistory times. It's pretty big now. It's bigger than Cedar Park. You know what I'm saying? Yeah, so it's a big city, which means that they have pretty sophisticated technology, culture, water systems, roads, all that kind of stuff for the time period. So keep all those folks together and under control. It's, it's pretty fancy stuff. And if you study that culture, you know that they had advanced mathematics, I think something like algebra, which is rude. I don't know why they needed that. The concept of a zero, which is it's a pretty profound concept in mathematics. It's pretty important. But they also built pyramids and temples, and they're good at architecture and building and roads and aqueducts, and they're fancy. Yeah, they're smart folks. So, and their cities, of course, are bigger than European cities during that time period. So if you had world history, you know all this stuff. Aztecs are kind of rough. Apparently, they have some military, there's some armies, and they also apparently do some ritual angry things like ripping people's hearts out every once in a while. So, those are your people. We won't mess with you. They eventually invaded, took over parts of the Incan Empire, most likely, but these combined folks, pretty smart. Yeah. Now, the book does emphasize, and I forgot to point this out in my 8:30 class because it's too early in the morning, that Europeans always felt like they were superior to American societies because they're European, also because they had metal tools. Yes, metal tools. I don't know why metal tools make you better. No, because you can make spears and knives and weapons and that sort of thing. So there you go. And it does help you take over other people. It does, yeah. So, and the book will also tell you there was a smallpox epidemic, and then there's some other religious things kind of happening at the same time that made Aztecs in particular think that they were going to have some sort of, I don't know, there was necessarily a second coming, but where their their church or their religion taught that there would be a incarnation of God on the earth, and that he would be shiny and white with dark hair. And then Cortez shows up there, who's apparently shiny and apparently white. He's shiny because of the body armor. That's not the right thing, but the armor that he's wearing. And he had dark hair. So he kind of came in at the right time, and they'd had some plagues and pestilence. And they go like, God is here. And then Cortez says, well, give me all your gold, and then conquered them. And then they figured out he wasn't God, but it was too late. So, all right. Mound, if you're looking for lots of people in one place in the what becomes the United States eventually, yeah, not so much. Middle of the country, Mississippi and Ohio Valley rivers, the mound building cultures probably had larger combinations of people. If you've lived in those places, it's probably because food's readily available. Stuff grows there really easily, and there's lots of animals and small ones, you know, like deer and whatever else is small that you might want to eat. My people probably squirrel. I'm sorry to the squirrel in the back porch. Yeah, I definitely would not eat you, but my dad's eating squirrel with dumplings, apparently squirrel and dumplings. Yeah, I'm going to go with a big no on that. A couple of you are going like, yeah, no, it's fine. No, it isn't. And it doesn't taste like chicken, no matter what you say. But in the middle of the country, it talks about your book, the biggest cultural center was Cahokia, but the book talks about some other place, and I can't remember the name of it. That's not as important, but it has a cooler name. So let me look, because I always forget about this. And then when I teach this class, which I don't teach as often, people talk about it, and I go like, why does that matter to you so much? And then I remember, oh yeah, it just has a cool name, and they don't know. So Cahokia is a bigger center of population. See if I can find it. Sorry, I should have looked it up before class. But the mound building culture is kind of big in the middle of the country. In the Southwest, Hopi and Zuni cultures, or Sunni, however you want to say it. And those are the folks who live, who we would think of as Pueblo Indians. Pueblo Indians. I'm looking, where does it say? Animism, yeah, we'll talk about that later. Mound builders. Pyramids, yeah, they do have, oh, I skipped a page, that's why I couldn't find it. Poverty Point, that's what it was called. And that's why they like it, because that's much more memorable than Cahokia. Poverty Point. Probably right in the middle of the Ozarks or something. It said actually it's near Louisiana, which is not cool, is it? That's just rude. All right. So mound builders, Hopi and Zuni, they lived in cliffs and canyons, and we think of them as pueblos. Most likely in the book, they talk about a Pueblo revolt that happens a little late. Oh, right there. Pueblo revolt in 1680. So that's kind of the combined name for those cultures. They're going to interact pretty strongly with Spanish explorers in that region. So they will be fluent in Spanish, which helps them collaborate or spy on the Spanish when they try to do stuff. All right. So mostly the mound building cultures probably interact more with the French. The Hopi and Sunni definitely interact more with the Spanish. And, you know, with the Spanish, it just depends on where they show up, because a lot of times they very loosely control an area. But if there are large concentrations of Spanish people or big missions or churches there, they're going to, you know, bug you. And in this region, kind of New Mexico, Arizona, there were a lot of trade routes, and they tried to control the trade in this region and force natives who lived in this region to be very Catholic, which they didn't really want to be. They didn't mind being a little Catholic, no. And the book will talk about some intersection of Mexican and Catholic cultures, which is how you get all of the Virgen de Guadalupe kind of things going on in that region. And, you know, Mexico, northern, what was northern Mexico eventually, not just yet, but will be pretty soon. All right, and the Pueblo Revolt, they pushed back quite a bit on the forced religion, and also they don't think the trade relationship's fair. So they eventually rebel against the Spanish, and they're able to get more control, more autonomy in their lives, which everyone wants. You can pay for stuff. Eastern tribes, they're smaller. They tend to gather in confederations. So the tribes tend to be smaller, but they'll have different groups of tribes that come together and form confederations, primarily for trade and to protect their regions or to deal with confederations from other regions. So smaller populations, probably more focused on tribes, but they operate together in confederations. This is because have you been to Pennsylvania, New York? Have you been there? The climate's terrible. Yeah, so it's harder to get food. Not as many people are going to live there because it's just, it's just not as conducive to growing food, finding food, that kind of stuff. Although if you live on the coast, there's always seafood, right? So, and you'll notice that a lot of the natives in this region, in the kind of the 13 original colonies region, really did subsist or exist on a lot of seafood. So like early meetings like Thanksgiving and stuff, they probably had fish. Why not? You catch a big fish, you got to eat it. Religion, these tribes tend to be more animistic, so animism's their thing, which means they think everything has a spirit in it, which means that Europeans thought that they're a bunch of heathens and they really needed to be converted. You think everything has a spirit, you're probably going to deal with things in a different sort of way. So if the spider has a spirit, you're probably not quite as likely to step on it unless you just don't care and you're just evil like that. But of course, we're definitely Americanized, so you might kill the spider. I don't know. But animism common, beliefs differed from group to group, but they do think that most things have a spirit that emanates from it, whether they're live things, plants and animals, or rocks and natural features and that sort of thing. Water. I don't know, is water alive? Things in the water are alive. Land ownership. The conflict in how Europeans and natives see land ownership is key to some of the disputes that they'll end up having and misunderstandings, which lead to disputes. So Native Americans really don't think that you can own the land. They think it's there for you to use. And I am not going to suggest to you that Native Americans are much more conservation oriented and that Europeans just come and throw plastic cups everywhere. It's early for that. But truthfully, both groups are going to want to use the land well and not want to harm the land because that's how they get their food. And you need food to live. They can't go to HEB. How tragic would that be? But their lives are very different and their material culture is pretty limited. So this is not a time period when people as a rule are wasting resources and polluting on purpose. And, it's not anything like that. So, I know it's kind of common for people to think of Native Americans as environmentalists and Europeans as wasteful. It's not exactly what's going on. Europeans think that God wants you, especially Protestant Europeans, think that God wants you to be as industrious as possible. So you should use all of the land. I mean, they already understood you should let like a fourth of it rest and rotate crops and things. But they think that you should develop as much land as possible, that it was okay to clear trees to make farmland, that sort of thing. Natives kind of thought you should live off of the land, maybe have a little bit of agriculture, but it's not going to be your main thing. They also tended to have smaller groups, so they didn't need to produce as much food, and they worked together tribally, whereas the common unit of life community, I suppose, was the family for Europeans. And I'm not saying Native Americans didn't like their families. I'm just saying they kind of saw everybody as working together as the ideal. And Dr. Foner talks about that quite a bit when he talks about how did Native Americans see freedom and autonomy versus Europeans. All this stuff's going to matter in how they get along and make deals and that sort of thing. Okay. Also, it does mention, and I didn't point this out, that the different Native American tribes don't all speak the same language. So Sometimes the language groups are related, so they may have some common words. There's usually a couple of folks in each tribe that are really good with language. Just like, you know, in your family, you got that one person that learns the foreign language really easily. And those people are quite important because you want to communicate with other people, especially, you know, within your confederation, but you're going to have cross confederation meetings as well. So the folks who learn languages really well are important. I think the early one we hear about a lot is Squanto. Squanto. You may remember him from 3rd grade when you dressed up as Puritans and Pilgrims and Native Americans, and Squanto was the cool one. All right. And then, oh, who's the woman that we put on the coin? Pocahontas. She's not the one we put on the coin. That's Sacagawea. But Pocahontas and Sacagawea are going to be important in cross-cultural communication as well. But for Pocahontas, it's more, you know, because she's cute. She's probably not cute because her dad has a lot of money. So the rich British guy, John Smith, wants to marry her because he admires her personality. She's really pretty. Nah, she's 12, so she's probably not really pretty. No offense if you're 12. You're probably really cute at 12. From stuff you read about Pocahontas, she wasn't, but her dad was, you know, in charge of the Powhatan tribes or confederation, so it was a big deal. All right, back to business, which that's part of business. Okay, and I forgot to check the chat, but you're not chatting. You're not chatting. Okay, it's the end of the day. The morning people, they chat a lot. Today is like, it's 4, we don't care. It's not even 4. 3:23, according to my computer. Although around lunch, my class kept saying, when does this class end? I'm like, dang, just a dagger in my heart. That's fine. Columbian Exchange, you definitely want to know what that is. You know, when I was a kid in the 80s, Columbian Exchange probably was not good and probably had something to do with Pablo Escobar. But when we talk about the Columbian Exchange, we're really talking about how groups native to the Americas and European groups trade stuff, either on purpose or accidentally. And if you're wondering how can you trade stuff accidentally, you know the answer. We're in the middle of a pandemic. You know the answer. Some of you probably got COVID, or somebody in your family got COVID. Did they ask for it? Did they try to get it? Did they say, please give me COVID? No, we just breathe on each other and get stuff. It's how it happens. So some of the exchange is disease. It is. And those diseases are primarily measles, smallpox, and the flu. Those primarily came from the Europeans to the Native Americans. And as I recall, Native Americans also shared a disease or two, but they tended to be sexually transmitted diseases. So those are hard. You got to work harder to get those. I'm not suggesting that you should. I'm just saying you won't get that because someone sneezes on you. Although again, child of the 80s, we weren't really sure how people got AIDS because it came out during that time period. So we had lots of people who were scared to use public bathrooms because you might get AIDS from the toilet seat. It's like, yeah, probably not. Probably not. But anyway, so the Columbian Exchange is also food. And I think, and your book has long lists of food that we traded back and forth. But, you know, cool stuff like tomatoes and potatoes and things like that, squash, beans, that kind of thing, corn, which I think Europeans see as, you know, just for the animals, and where sometimes we see that as for us, because you probably eat corn from time to time. I'm from the Midwest. We eat a lot of corn. It's what we do. Corn and mashed potatoes every meal. I'm just saying, you can never get enough starch. All right, so food exchange, and also populations, although primarily we had Europeans coming to the Americas, not as many natives going to Europe, although when they did, they usually got terrible disease and died. There's also some intermixing of culture. You see that primarily with European men and Native American women, but it does sometimes go the other way as well. And also they traded stuff. Europeans tended to have more metal objects, which Native Americans thought were cool because they didn't have as much of those things. and then more decorative things, maybe some gold and silver occasionally from the Native Americans, although, and you know, that's why all the Europeans came over was for gold and silver, but it's not everywhere in the United States what becomes the United States. Maybe my backyard with the squirrels, but probably not. The Columbian Exchange tended to be pretty good for trade, pretty bad for Native American population, which was decimated. And I know that you know that there was a great loss of Native American life. And I think we always sort of assume that's just Europeans just going around hacking people up and killing them, which they did do from time to time. But this is primarily from disease, according to anthropologists who believe that the population losses of 80 to 90% were due primarily to the exchange of disease. And there just wasn't immunity in the Americas to these European diseases. There just wasn't, especially in what becomes the United States, the 13 original colonies, because those population groups were so small and so isolated from each other. They just didn't build up much immunity to diseases because they didn't see anybody. And especially places with a lot of trade, they got a lot of international not conflict. What is the word I'm looking for? I don't know. My head hurts today. I'm so sorry. International. I can't think of the word. But they ran into each other a bunch. Yeah, trade, exchange, that sort of thing. So they also traded germs. Okay. All right. Now it's time to talk about religion. Are you ready? Religion. No one ever fights about this. It's right up there with politics. But our purposes for religion shouldn't lead to too many arguments, except occasionally, I'm just going to say it, if you're Mormon, sometimes you'll fight with me, but don't. It's not my goal here. Here's the thought. Okay. We're going to talk about Christianity, okay, in very, very general terms. Okay, you ready? Comment because I said Mormon, sorry. Okay. Brief version of the textbook. It probably will work. I have no idea how much different it is than the other one. So if somebody's friends with Reese and you have the not brief version of the book, scan him a page or two and send it to him so he can see how it's different. I'm sorry that I don't know. This textbook, I think it's really brief for a textbook, but it has, let me look, how many pages? That's the appendix. 600, about 600 pages. So I don't know how brief the brief book is. So that's all I have for you. Sorry. That was not, and I'm sorry, I just ruined the fact that you didn't ask the whole class that. I'm so sorry. Okay, all right. But if anybody has the brief version, anybody has the not brief version, if you guys want to talk about how those are different, that is cool. While I talk about religion and offend people. Okay, here it is. Back when I started teaching 182 years ago, or in 1990, and I started kind of Midwest, but also in Texas too. It was culturally pretty common for people to go to church, and they were fairly familiar with church. Okay, I think in the modern era, people don't go to church. There's statistics to back that up. And it probably means that you're not as familiar with religious texts or religious tradition, that kind of stuff. Although I'm not saying you're a bunch of heathens. I'm just saying, back in the day when we went to church 2 or 3 times a week, people don't do that as much. And people would be like really intense about their church, like my church is better than yours, like they were, sports teams or something, or political parties. So we had more things to fight about. And now people just go like, it's a Christian country, most kind of, sort of, but we don't care so much. Okay. So Christianity, for our purposes, is going to have 2 major groups. You ready? 2 major groups. Catholics and not Catholics. Okay. So if you're a Catholic, you already know, like you go to church, it says Catholic Church, there's a priest, you know who the Pope is, you're Catholic. If you're Protestant, it means you're Christian, but you're not Catholic, okay? So if you're Baptist, you're Protestant. In my book, if you're Mormon, you're Protestant. That's when I upset some Mormons one year. It's like, yeah, for our purposes, just be Protestant, just live with it. If you go to Church of the whatever and you read the Bible, you're Protestant. Okay, so Catholic, Protestant. Protestants are not Catholic, okay? That's all we got, Catholic, Protestant. And all of them are Christians, because sometimes I'll have people who are Catholics like, I'm not a Christian. I go like, you really are. You're a Catholic, but you're also a Christian because you follow Christ, who's kind of the, he's integral in both Protestantism and Catholicism. But this is the era where the Catholics and Protestants split, because a Catholic priest, this Martin Luther fellow, who is not Martin Luther King Jr., that's a whole different fellow. But Martin Luther, who's a German priest, said, I really love the church. I'd like for it to be better. Here are 95 ways it could be better. And he writes them out and he hammers them to the door of the church, thinking, hey, I bet the priests will look at this. They did. They weren't terribly impressed. So rather than embracing the 95 changes, they said, you know what? Why don't you shut the heck up, Martin Luther, or something like that. The main thing that he was the most concerned about was something called indulgences, which is not like too much chocolate, or for me, Coke Zero. It's probably worse. I know Coke Zero and chocolate are beautiful. Indulgences, not so much. You may or may not be as familiar with the Catholic Church, but if you're a Catholic, one of your sacraments is something called confession. I'm sure you go like, yeah, I do that one all the time. That's where you go to the priest and you go like, hey, Father, forgive me for I have sinned. It's been 8 years since my last confession. And since then I have cheated in my history class twice, which would be like mortal sin. I mean, I don't even know how you get forgiven for that. But then the priest tells you like, oh, that's okay. He doesn't say that. But he says, for penance, you need to go apologize to your history professor and do 3 Hail Marys. So, usually there's an act of contrition and you may have to make amends, that kind of thing. But in those days, you could also pay an indulgence, which is where it's like, I've sinned, and the priest goes, just give me $50 and we'll call it even. It isn't exactly how it went, but it's kind of how it went. And then they would say, your sins are forgiven. And you could also pay for your dead relatives, so you get them out of purgatory faster. So here's the deal. Martin Luther said, I don't think that's exactly what God intended here. I think that might be wrong on our part. And the church is going like, yeah, we don't care. It's a pretty big moneymaker. Yeah. So they really didn't want to reform that. So Martin Luther, I don't think, was trying to end the Catholic Church. He surely wasn't trying to start his own church, but that's kind of what ends up. And then you end up with the Lutherans and a Protestant wing of Christianity. And then the British go like, yeah, we want to do that too, but it's mostly because our king wants a divorce, not because of indulgences. Plus, we don't really like Germans because no one ever did. Sorry if you're German, I'm kidding. People love Germans, except, 20th century. But you start to see splits in the church, and a lot of them have to do with religious concerns. A lot of them have to do with political and economic concerns as well. So as I mentioned, the British Church, the Church of England, they end up splitting from the Catholic Church and forming their own church because King Henry VIII wants a divorce, and the person he wants to divorce is a pretty devout Catholic whose family also donates a lot of money to the church. So the Pope is not going to grant them a divorce. So they go like, oh, that's cool. I'll start my own church and give myself a divorce. And that's how it works. Yeah. Okay. So some of this stuff is pretty deep and theological. Some of it's I want a divorce. That's why new churches start. So, and what's tricky is if you're Catholic, you know it. If you're Protestant, you probably have no idea. And Protestants are really, I say this as someone who, my husband grew up in the Catholic Church, but I'm definitely, not so much. Oh, something weird happened. Did it happen on your screen? Probably not. Can you still see the notes?
Yeah, it's good now.
Okay, good. Sorry, I don't know what I did. But there are like 80,000 different kinds of Protestants. It's very confusing. And I don't know. It's just confusing. Catholics, you just typically go to the closest church. Yeah. Protestants, like, no, we got to pick the one that likes the carpet we like, and the style of music we like, and the pre-sermon snacks that we like, although probably not during COVID, and whatever else, the translation of the Bible we like. Protestants, yeah, we make it hard. We do. All right, I'm going to go on. So, and one thing that you'll notice is that in the early days, the Catholic Church, you know this already because you had world history, was more than just a church. They were also the government. You had the Holy Roman Empire, who wasn't always holy and certainly wasn't always Roman, but they definitely had a lot of political and economic control, so much so that when the Spanish and the Portuguese started colonizing in the Americas, they were fighting, and they said, Pope, help us out. And Treaty of Tordesillas, he just gets a map, draws a line and says, okay, Spanish folks, you can have this part of South America. Portuguese folks, you can have this part. So Portuguese folks got Brazil, Spanish folks got everything else. And you're thinking, well, that's not fair. Brazil's really big though, so it is. All right, so Catholic Church is really big, but then when England split and they started colonizing, they wanted to talk about how more moral they were as colonizers. And that kind of starts during this time period with the writings of the guy whose name is highlighted in yellow, Bartolome de las Casas. And this guy had grown up, I think he was a lawyer before he was a priest. So he's from a pretty wealthy family that gets you lots of education. And then he comes over with the conquistadores because, you know, they wanted the 3 G's. You know this from 8th grade, God, gold, and glory. So you got to take the priest with you. Otherwise, the God part doesn't look quite as legit. And then the conquistadores can handle the gold and the glory part. Las Casas was in the Americas for over 50 years and was disturbed and concerned about how the conquistadores treated the natives, because often they just killed them and stole their gold, or killed them and stole their land, or killed them and stole their women, or played baby toss to see, or threw spears through people to see how many people they could send one spear through. It's pretty rough stuff. So he chronicles all this stuff in a book called Destruction of the Indies, but it's really long. And he's sending it to the king, so the king will read it and say, like, oh my gosh, I can't believe we're doing this. We're misrepresenting the Church of God, and it's not good. But it was so long, he thought, the king will never read this. So he made it shorter, and we call that account the short account of the destruction of the Indies, which you could read for your book review. But I don't know how many stories you want of have gruesome ways to kill people, but that book is full of them. It is. Yeah, it's not a great book. You're wondering, have I read it? Shoot, I'm a history professor. Yeah, I've read it. I have. Just the short account. Sorry, weird noises. I think the squirrels are after me because I was talking about them. All right, sorry. But De las Casas writes about things that he's seen and things that he's heard from other priests about the way conquistadores mistreat the people whose lands that they take when they're supposed to be spreading the ideas of the Catholic Church. And they do a lot of, convert to Catholicism or will kill you sort of things, which, is probably not a good conversion plan, seems to defeat some purposes of your religious principles. So in his goal of getting the king of Spain to say, we've got to change that, we're misrepresenting the church, the king of Spain just goes like, yeah, it's bad, but money, and we're making a lot of it. But then the British read the book and go like, see, we're much nicer than the Spanish, and they develop something called the Black Legend, which is the idea of using the atrocities that De las Casas talks about to accuse the Catholic Church and Catholic nations, primarily Spain and Portugal, of atrocities and improprieties, and suggesting that the British are much better and kinder and gentler, and that Protestants in general are much better than Catholics. Yeah. And it will lead to a pretty strong anti-Catholic bias in the United States, except for the part that we live in. Yeah, the part of the United States we live in, I don't think you see that as much. And same in Florida. In places that used to be part of Mexico or where Spain colonized pretty heavily earlier, you don't see that as much. But in the Northeast, much more. I know I grew up in the Midwest, and I went to super important information. I went to a Bible college that was a seminary. I don't know why, it's a long story. I just thought it would be interesting, and it was. So that was my year off college. I went to a seminary and a really super fundamentalist Protestant seminary where they taught that the Catholic Church was a cult, which was the most fascinating thing to me ever. But that was a very Midwestern kind of thing. In the South, well, the Southwest, the Deep South, who even knows? But the Southwest or Florida, like nobody thinks the Catholic Church is a cult. We just think it's the Catholic Church. So, but during this time period, anything they could do to denigrate the Catholic Church was seen as good. Okay. This is the part where I really kind of got brief on the notes. It talks a lot in your book about French exploration, where they went, Spanish exploration, where they went, Dutch, Portuguese, all that kind of stuff. And I just went, hey, people went places. And your book talks about why they went places and inventions they had. I am not going to ask you questions about, who had what colony, what was the name of the most prominent Portuguese explorer, probably Vasco da Gama, probably, I don't know. But I'm not going to ask you stuff like that. I'm going to ask you kind of the bigger, broader, it applies more to the United States sort of stuff, just to fulfill many stereotypes about US history classes. And also because it's a survey. And your quizzes will be relatively short. They tend to be about 20 questions, so 4 or 5 questions per chapter. I'm probably not going to have one question about which French guy, found the Northwest Passage. I'm probably not. So sorry if you like French explorers. French exploration, on that note, primarily through what we think of as modern day Canada. Look in search of the Northwest Passage, which was the idea you could sail across the globe going a little farther north because there wouldn't be any land there because they didn't know, about Canada. Yeah, they just didn't know. Yeah. So, and down the Mississippi River. And also, if you've lived in the middle of the country or Louisiana, you'll notice that along the Mississippi River, a bit down the Ohio as well, that there is a lot of French cultural influence. Like I grew up in Missouri, St. Louis, very, a lot of French cultural influence. You grew up in Louisiana, it'd be hard not to notice French influence. You'd have had to been ignoring stuff, which I'm sure you weren't. Natives tended to like the French because there were fewer of them. They typically didn't bring families. And this is true of pretty much every other exploration European country except Spain, because Spain, they didn't necessarily bring families, but they brought those armies that killed people. So least popular exploration or European explorers, probably Spain because of armies and death. Second least popular, probably England because of families and we're taking your land and we're giving you smallpox and the flu and whatever else we're giving you so you all die. And then everybody else is pretty popular. The French are popular because it's mostly dudes and they come in like, hey, you want to trade stuff? And they go like, sure, let's trade stuff. Or like, hey, your daughter's cute, can I marry her? And we'll trade some stuff. And they tended to be okay with that. Even their priests, like you've read about the Spanish priests, they're a little rough. They come in, it's like, you've got to learn Latin. We're going to build these big plazas and churches in the middle of our missions, and you're dirty, so you got to stay outside, and we'll preach to you from the portico or the balcony, and you better learn some Latin. And the French priest is like, hey, let me learn your language and I'll talk to you about God. So they're a little different. They kind of blend in, they assimilate to the Native American culture, where the Spanish Explorers demand that you assimilate to their culture, and the Spanish priests demand that when you convert that you assimilate to their culture. Now, I know that changes over time and it's a big generalization. It kind of works in the early parts of exploration. The French, because smaller groups of folks, more likely to fit into and not threaten the tribes, and because they don't come in those large groups, they also don't spread as many diseases. There you go. Dutch, same thing. The Dutch come in, they set up trading outposts. They don't want your land at all. They just want to trade with you. They just want to make money. And the book talks a lot about the Dutch. We'll talk more about them when we talk about the next couple of chapters. But the Dutch, they're pretty free thinking. They want you to have some political freedom of speech. They don't care how you worship. They just want to make some money. Yeah, the Dutch are about making money. So their trading outpost in New Amsterdam, New Netherlands will eventually become what we think of, that colony that's New York. And it tends to be the financial center of the first 13 colonies and still kind of the financial center of the United States. But the Dutch really open about pretty much everything, kind of the same way you think of the Dutch in the modern era. Yeah, okay. And they also not terribly nationalistic. They really do just want to trade. So they don't have a big army. Yeah, they just don't, which is part of the reason they didn't keep their colony, because the English, they like the military. So they took over. Yeah. And the French had some military, but the French and the English tended to fight each other. Yeah. And the natives liked the French more, hence later on the French and Indian War, because the French and the Indians tend to side together. With the exception of the Iroquois, who apparently are pretty vicious and said, we really admire these British people. They're taking folks over and they're kind of rough. We can do that too. So the Iroquois tend to side with the British. Do you care about any of this? And most of the other native groups will side with the French when there's conflict between the French and the British. Everyone would side with the Dutch if they could, but it's never really an option because the Dutch don't have a military. Okay. I feel like we're we are kind of to the end there for the day. So what I think you should do before I see you next time is finish reading chapter 1, if you can do that. And you guys may want to exchange information with each other. I assume you can see each other's names. You probably know each other a little bit. If you want to find out how the books are different, if you got the brief edition versus the Seagull edition versus I got the one from the school edition, they're all probably pretty similar. They probably are, would be my guess. I would assume the brief edition is the shortest. I'm going to assume that. And start working on question number 1. Maybe work on a draft before Tuesday. Maybe work on it Monday or something if you have some free time. And then, send it to me by Wednesday if you want me to look at it before you submit it. Next week, we'll talk about question number 2. In chapter number 2, we can go over this again if you need to, and if you have any other questions, we can go over those as well. I think I'll probably stop recording. Okay, stop sharing. Now we can see each other's faces or baby pictures. That's pretty cute. Let me stop the recording.